So the first thing we're going to do is one of these lines here. Hopefully you can see the pattern okay. Maybe I'll do some on the other side just to show you if not. So you want to pull the thread back through the needle so you've just got a couple of centimetres tail at the end. Don't pull too quickly or too hard because it will come unthreaded. It's very frustrating. You can obviously just rethread it, but so just be gentle when you're doing that part. So you start by just punching into the fabric, simple as that. Make sure you go all the way down until your needle hits the fabric, and that's how you're going to ensure that all of the loops on the other side are the exact same length. And then you're going to pull the needle up, you're going to go along very slightly and back down again. So your stitch lengths are going to be, I think they're a couple of millimeters, yeah, about 2 millimeters, which sounds very small, sounds very fiddly, but you'll get used to it. So when you pull the punch needle up, you're going to keep the needle pretty much touching the fabric. You don't have to scrape the fabric, but just don't lift up too high. If you lift up too high, you'll start to pull the loops back out. Punch down, lift the needle out, but don't take it away from the fabric. Go a couple of millimeters along and punch back down again. And then we're going to turn it over and you'll see the lovely little loops that are created. And I love seeing them the first time you start a new piece, clean piece of fabric, and I love seeing those first loops go in. If you can see, that fourth one there is smaller, and that's because that's where I lifted the needle up higher away from the fabric, and that's why that stitch, that loop is a different length. So that's not what we want, and that's why we keep our needle close to the fabric when we lift up. So we're going to do the next line now. So again, make sure the tail of your thread isn't too long. Pull it back so you've just got a couple of centimeters, and then we're going to start punching the next line. With my designs and with the thread that we're using, the stitches really do have to be quite small in length, and I'll show you that on the next line. Actually, I'll show you why. So keep punching along. When you've got to get to the end of the line, grip the thread so that you can move the needle away easily without pulling the loop out, and then cut it off with your scissors. It's really important that you have a nice sharp pair of scissors, because quite often what happens is you try to snip through and you think it's snipped all the way through and it hasn't gone all the way through the thread, and then you pull the needle and it will start to pull all the loops back out again. What's really important as you're punching is to make sure that you've got lots of loose thread. If the thread gets too tight and the thread can't move easily through the needle, then it's going to affect your stitches, and it will start to pull them back out rather than allowing you to stitch freely. So always make sure you've got lots of thread loose, ready to go. So that's the second line done. Now I'll show you what happens if you did stitches longer in length. The loops are then obviously too far apart from each other, and the backing fabric is going to show. which is obviously not what you want. You want the loops nice and close together so that none of the backing fabric and definitely none of the pen shows. So if you've seen other punch needle tutorials where they're using much thicker yarn, then obviously the stitches would never need to be this close together. If you're using, you know, thick kind of wool, then they are going to be further apart even than this, but it depends on obviously what thread you're using, what backing fabric you're using. So again, for this fabric, for this size of thread, you want the stitches really close together. The next thing we're going to do is just practice doing this wavy line here. So again, pull your thread back down, making sure we're not wasting any. Perhaps give your needle another check, just make sure it's not moving. Still 2 centimeters. You can give it another tighten just in case. Again, just punch in a couple of centimeters and just follow the line. And you can see the little loops being created. I don't know if I can show you from the other side. I'll probably go off the pattern a little bit, but no, I can't do it from the other side. But you can see that the fabric grips the thread and makes a cute little loop. And that's how punch needle works. But I can't do it that way around. So you can see what I've done there. I've pulled my needle too far back, and then it's going to start pulling that out. If that happens and you make a mistake, you can pull your loops out. It will look like little holes in the fabric, but they're not actually holes, they're just where the threads have moved out of the way to allow the punch needle through. So what you can then do is just gently move the fabric, the threads of the fabric back in place, and it's almost as good as new again. I think it does slightly weaken the fabric probably, so you don't want to do this lots and lots of times. So once you've kind of done it once and made a mistake, try not to do it again in the same place. So what you can then do is pull the yarn back through so that it's the right length, ready to start punching again, and just pick up where you left off. And make sure to keep your fingers out of the way, because it can be quite painful if you punch into one of your fingers. And you can see my yarn here is just starting to get not tangled, but just twisted up a little bit. So when you feel it getting a bit tighter, make sure you loosen it up again. And it's definitely a good idea if you've got pets to do this in a room when they're not around or they can't get in. I haven't got any pets, but I imagine, especially if you had a cat, they're going to have a lot of fun with this. And obviously if the cat gets hold of it and pulls any of the threads, they're all going to come out. Okay, again, pinch, pull the needle back, and then cut it off. So there's our wavy line done. Okay, so you can see that the stitches are nice and close to one another. So we're going to do this part next and fill in the entire shape so that you can see what it looks like when you put the lines closer together. So I might actually change the colour of the thread for this, just in case the camera isn't picking it up as well as another. So I'm going to change to my green colour. So again, if you've brought one of my kits, I'll give you plenty of extra thread for this practice piece, and I will show you or it will inform you of which thread it is that you can use as a practice. It might be obvious from the colour, but if not, you know, certain patterns won't use a whole ball of yarn. So then I will say to you, you can use half a ball of yarn for practice, or half a ball of this colour, half a ball of another colour, if that makes sense. Punch through exactly as you did before. And go up this straight line here. Oh, they look nice and neat, don't they? So you're going to turn the needle round. We've just gone round this little corner here. So if you finish a part and you want to start again, so it might be that you need to stop and go and do something else and come back to it, or if your thread has run out and you need to start a new ball of yarn, then what you do is you're going to go back in the same hole that you came out of. Okay, otherwise there'll be a little gap. So back in that hole we finished off, and then you can just carry on. Now I'm stopping and starting projects all the time, so I've got two young children, so it's quite often when I'm doing one of these that I stop and start hundreds of times probably. So if you do have to stop and do anything, I would recommend that you leave the needle in the fabric like that, put the ball on top, and then keep it safely out of way, definitely out of the way of the reach of little children or animals, as I've already mentioned about the cats. One time I'd almost finished a whole embroidery, one of my lions, and my daughter, who's 1.5, came along, picked up my pair of scissors, and she actually stabbed through my fabric and ripped it, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to repair that, so I was devastated, but it was my fault for leaving scissors within her reach. So I'm going to carry on here around the corner. Keep pulling your thread so that it's nice and loose. And occasionally just keep turning over and just checking that everything's okay. Checking that your needle length hasn't changed and none of the loops look a different length. And then we're just going to finish back where we started. And again, we're going to finish in the same hole that we started in. Pinch the thread and cut it off neatly. So then we're going to fill in this shape. That's what the shape looks like at the moment. You can really start anywhere, it doesn't really matter. I would say perhaps on a shape like this, maybe don't start in the exact same corner again, because then you've got lots of loose tails in one place. So I'm just going to start right in the middle. So you can see they're nice and neatly next to each other. So when you're doing your second row, sorry, I should have said this first, you want to keep your rows really close together so that there's no gap in between the two rows. Keep pulling your thread out, and I'll show you what happens if you leave a gap. So those two I've kept nice and neatly together, and you can see on the other side that in between those two rows you can't see any of the white fabric, and that's what you want. So when I go around the corner here, if I start to stitch a little bit further apart, and leave a gap. And it might look really small. You can see it's less than a millimetre, but when you turn it over, you'll be able to see some of the backing fabric. Now, if the gap is quite small, when we do stitches either side, it's going to push these together and it might not show too much. However, you don't really want to risk it. So it's best if you've left a little gap and it shows on the other side, pull your stitches out, push the threads of the fabric back together again, being quite gentle. Pull your thread back down the needle so that it's touching the fabric again. I think I've twisted it, untwist it. Gently pull back, and then you can start again and make sure your row is nice and close together. So obviously you can move the hoop around and do whichever way it feels comfortable for you to be moving the needle forwards. If you come to a corner or the edge of a part and you think, oh, should I do one stitch or two? I don't know if you can see how much of a gap is left there. You're always going to be better to do 2 stitches rather than 1. If you do 1, then you might risk there being a gap again, like there was on our line that we left more gaps. So you're always better to do 2 stitches rather than 1 when you think you need to. So we're going to come up to where we started on our second row. And we're going to punch into pretty much the same hole that we started again. Now, you could cut off the thread and start another row, or you could turn your needle round, stitch outwards slightly, turn around so your needle's facing the right way again. Again, that's why it's really handy to have this screw in the same direction as the front of your needle, and then you always know which way's forward. So then you can turn it and carry on doing the next row. And again, just keep checking on the other side, see what it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to fill this in, and then we'll come back and do the next part.